Martín Aguilar was 52 years old, and he had spent more than 30 of those years behind the wheel. He knew Highway 57 like the back of his hand. Every curve, every taco stand, every abandoned rest stop where he used to sleep when sleep overcame him. He was a man of quiet faith, of few words, of short prayers murmured at dawn before starting his trailer. He had no wife or children. His life was the road. He left San Luis Potosí and crossed northern Mexico, transporting machinery, construction, materials, sometimes fruit. And although the silence sometimes weighed on him, he preferred it to the noise of the past. He had never believed in strange things, but he never made fun of anyone who did either. God knows best, he always said, as if to end any awkward conversation. If this opening has already captivated you, don't leave without subscribing. This channel can only continue telling these stories if you choose to support it. That April afternoon, however, something changed. Martín was headed towards Saltillo when he heard on the truck's radio that a section of Highway 57 was closed for roadwork. Without giving it much thought, he took a less-traveled detour that would take him along an older route, skirting the first hills of the Arteaga Mountains. He expected nothing more than a few potholes and dusty landscapes, but as he rounded a sharp curve in the middle of an unmarked area, he saw them, 4 figures dressed in white, standing motionless on the side of the road, staring directly at him. He braked sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no one else for miles, and yet he swore those women were waiting for him. Martín cautiously got out of the truck. The air was still, as if even the wind had stopped to watch. He took a few steps toward where he'd seen the figures, but they were gone. Not a trace, not a footprint on the ground, only the sound of the trees moving without moving. He returned to the vehicle, confused, uneasy. He checked the mirrors, looked into the distance. Nothing. He started the engine with trembling hands and continued on his way. But when he got in, he found something impossible on the passenger seat. An old notebook with worn leather covers and faded letters. It wasn't his. He didn't remember having seen it before, and the strangest thing, it smelled of incense, of a convent, of confinement. Want to know what was in that notebook? Then do something for this story. Subscribe now. Only then can we continue, sharing what others prefer to keep quiet. With the engine running, he flipped through the first few pages. The handwriting was feminine, neat, ancient. Sister Teresa of the Spirit, Year of Our Lord, 1990. His eyes widened with each line. This wasn't an ordinary diary. It was a confession. It spoke of a different order, of rituals on the mountain, of a mission that must not be interrupted. They are taking us to seal the 4th gate, read one of the entries. Mother Constanza has had visions. The veil between the worlds is weakening. We must reinforce the seals. Martín slammed the diary shut. A part of him wanted to throw it out of the truck and forget, but another, stronger part knew he had found that notebook for a reason. For hours, Martín couldn't stop thinking about what he had read. Every curve in the road seemed to whisper something to him. At the next stop, at a nearly deserted gas station, he asked the attendant if he knew of any stories about missing nuns. The man, gray-haired and glassy-eyed, lowered his voice. Years ago, many. They say that some nuns from the Santa Clara convent got lost in this area, that they were on a retreat. They never arrived. Martín nodded silently. He didn't say a word about the notebook, but when he got back to the truck, he wrapped it in a blanket and tucked it under the seat, as if protecting it, or as if protecting the world from what it contained. That night, he didn't sleep in a hotel. He stopped his trailer next to an old, abandoned roadside shelter covered in graffiti and weeds. He had used it before, years before. It was a secluded place, perfect for uninterrupted rest. But when he closed his eyes, dreams came like a storm. He saw underground tunnels, altars covered in dried blood, hooded women chanting in a language he didn't know, and at the end, a figure with a face burned by fire, whispering his name. Martín, you opened the rift. He woke up drenched in sweat, the echo of that voice still, vibrating in his chest. At dawn, Martín decided to retrace his steps. He couldn't continue as if nothing had happened. Something inside him was pushing him to understand. He reread the diary more calmly, noting places, dates, symbols. On one of the last pages, a name was mentioned. Brotherhood of Silence. He had never heard of it. He searched his cell phone but found nothing, only empty pages and broken links. The little he knew was what the nun had written, a secret order founded centuries ago, charged with guarding the borders between light and shadow. According to the text, their final mission was to seal something that lay dormant in the mountains, something that must never awaken. He decided to go to Torreon, where the newspaper reported a last confession made to an old driver. Martín knew the city well. He stopped at a truck repair shop where his brakes had once been fixed. The owner, Don Ezequiel, was an older man with a sad look. Martín didn't explain everything. He just showed the nun's name and asked if she knew anything. Ezequiel paled. He was slow to speak. She came here once. She was nervous. She asked me to take a letter to someone in Saltillo. I never knew who it was for, but I remember that before he left, he looked at me and said, "If you ever walk on that road again, it's because the seal is weakening." Ezequiel's words floated in Martín's head like an echo impossible to ignore. That same afternoon, he looked for the old foster home, the diary, mentioned in a brief passage. It was on the outskirts of Parras, almost devoured by time. Fallen walls, glassless windows, weeds everywhere. But as he entered, something made him stop. On the back wall, almost erased by the humidity, there was a symbol drawn in charcoal, just like the one repeated in the diary pages. It was like an eye with an inverted cross in the center, surrounded by thorns. Martín approached and, without knowing why, placed his hand on it. A shiver ran down his spine, and for a moment he swore he heard a little girl crying behind the wall. He didn't tell anyone. He just wrote down the address on a piece of paper and took photos of the symbol. That night, as he tried to sleep, he had visions again. This time, they weren't dreams, but fragments of memories that didn't belong to him. He saw 4 women dressed in white, dragging a huge cross down a stone hallway. He saw fire. He saw iron gates that closed by themselves. And he saw a woman with a firm face, dark eyes, and a calm voice saying, "Mother Constanza will not allow the pact to be broken." When he woke up, the truck's clock read 3:33. Outside, everything was silent. But inside the vehicle, the diary had changed places. It was open to a page he didn't remember reading. On that new page, the writing seemed more agitated, as if it had been written in haste or fear. It said, "The 3rd gate is beneath the abandoned San Rafael station. We must not leave it alone. What sleeps there hears the names of those who doubt." Martín read that sentence over and over again. San Rafael. He remembered passing by it years ago when freight trains still ran. Today, it was just a shell of its former self. Upon arrival, he found what he expected: rusted structures, broken cars, weeds growing between the rails. But what he didn't expect was the trapdoor hidden beneath a wooden plank covered with dry leaves. He opened it with effort. He went down. Below, the air was heavy, damp, ancient. A stone tunnel stretched into the darkness. Using his cell phone's flashlight, Martín took one step forward. The walls were covered in inscriptions he didn't understand, but one in particular stopped him. "Here sleeps the fragmented. Don't name it. Don't see it." At that moment, a gust of wind pushed him forward, as if someone were breathing down his neck. He stumbled, fell to his knees, and when he looked ahead, he saw something he would never forget. A hooded figure, floating a few meters away, its feet lifted off the ground. It had no face, just a moving shadow. Martín closed his eyes, prayed hard, and when he opened them, there was nothing. If this story has touched your heart, don't hesitate to subscribe. It's the only way this channel can continue bringing you stories like this one. Martín made his way out of the tunnel as best he could, his legs shaking and his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't speak to anyone that day. He drove aimlessly until night fell upon him like a heavy blanket. He parked somewhere random, got out of the truck and walked aimlessly through bushes and rocks until he knelt in a clearing. He screamed. He didn't ask for help or answers, he just screamed, as if his soul needed to be emptied. When he returned to the truck, he found something else on the dashboard, a small blackened wooden cross, identical to the one that had appeared in the nun's hands in his visions. He didn't know how it had gotten there, but it was there. The next morning, she decided to look for a priest, not just any priest, but Father Hilario, an old acquaintance of her mother's, who had served in a convent decades ago. She found him in a humble parish in Ramos Arizpe. Upon hearing the story, Hilario stopped him with a single glance. He went to the back of the sacristy and returned with a book bound in red leather. He placed it on the table without opening it. "What you're touching isn't new," the priest said in a subdued voice. "They sealed it in 1842. They tried to open it in 1921. And every time someone approaches, the world trembles. Those women, they weren't just nuns, they were custodians, martyrs, and if they returned, it wasn't by mistake." Father Hilario then told him about the Sisterhood of Silence. According to him, it was a parallel order to the church, authorized by ancient councils, but never officially recognized. Its existence was denied by the Vatican, but some bishops knew about it. It was formed by women who renounced not only the world, but also language. They took vows of perpetual silence because they believed certain words opened portals that connected this world with the other side. Martín listened without interrupting, feeling each sentence weigh more heavily on his shoulders. "Sister Teresa was one of the last," Hilario said. "If she wrote, she broke the vow. If she left that diary, it was because she knew there would be no more time." Martín left the church without speaking. He drove on automatic aimlessly. But everything he'd heard kept pushing him back to the same place. The Arteaga Mountains. The diary had one last clue, a ruined chapel at the top of Cerro del Cobre. No one had been up there since the 1990s. Access was tricky, but his truck had enough power. It took him almost 3 hours to get there. When he got out, he found it just as he imagined. Broken stones, fallen stained glass windows, and an altar covered in moss. But what paralyzed him was the black stain running down the walls, as if they were weeping tar. There, between the broken pews, he found a lit candle, and there was no wind, no signs of life, just that impossible fire. Martín approached the candle with slow, almost reverent steps. Beside him, an open Bible displayed a marked page, Revelation 9, and it was given to them not to kill, but to be tormented for 5 months. The rest of the text was underlined in dried ink. Beneath the Bible, a teardrop-shaped silver locket with a barely legible inscription, "To seal, it must hurt." He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he felt it in his stomach, as if a buried truth had been awakened. He took the locket. As soon as he did, a buzzing sound filled the air. It wasn't coming from outside, but from inside his head, as if an ancestral frequency had been activated. He left the chapel, his legs shaking. He got into the truck and stayed inside for hours without starting it. He couldn't get the thought of the seal and the pain out of his mind. Then he remembered an accident he'd experienced 20 years earlier in that same area. A collision with a smaller vehicle on a curve. He survived. But the other driver, a young woman with a serene face, died instantly. He'd never spoken about it. She'd dragged him along in silence. That night, for the first time, he understood. It wasn't just any accident. In the days before the crash, he'd encountered a strange figure on the side of the road, identical to Sister Teresa. He'd never told anyone about it. Until now, he'd thought it was a hallucination, but it wasn't. Martín realized that his life had been intertwined with that mystery long before he opened the diary. The crash, the figure on the road, the Black Cross. Everything was part of a chain of events he couldn't fully understand, but which dragged him on relentlessly. With the reliquary in his pocket and the diary on the passenger seat, he headed to a crypt Father Hilario had mentioned near Cuatro Ciénegas. He said that Mother Constanza, the last superior of the Brotherhood, or at least what remained of her, was buried there. Upon arriving, he found a stone structure sunk into the ground, hidden behind an old cemetery. The door was locked with a rusty chain. He didn't hesitate. He broke it with a crowbar and entered. The interior was cold, colder than the outside. It smelled of earth, dried incense, and something even harder to describe: memory. The crypt was almost empty, save for a central, unmarked tomb. As he drew closer, he saw that there were fingernail marks on the tombstone, as if someone had tried to leave. He lit a candle and placed the locket on the stone. As he did so, he heard a barely audible whisper, "Thank you, son." The flame flickered, and a gust of air swept through the room. In that instant, the weight he'd been carrying, years of guilt, silence, ignorance, seemed to lighten. But he also realized that it wasn't enough to find clues. He had to close the doors, all of them, or the world would eventually open them itself. As he left the crypt, Martín felt something had changed, not just in the air, but within him, as if a part of his soul had been left behind, sealed with that whisper. That night, as he slept in the truck, he dreamed of Sister Teresa. He saw her younger, with a clean face, her eyes closed and her lips moving soundlessly. She handed him 3 iron keys and pointed to a map drawn on the ground. He woke up with the drawing still fresh in his mind. An old water station in Monclova, a destroyed mill in Viesca, and an unnamed hill near General Cepeda. Each place marked a door. 3. He'd already been to one. 2 more to go. He decided to start with the mill. Upon arrival, he found it shrouded in ruins, overgrown with weeds. There were no signs of life, only silence. Upon entering, he saw symbols etched into the ground, identical to those in the tunnel under the station. In the center, a flat stone with just enough room for one of the keys. He placed it without hesitation. A creek ran through the place, and the ground vibrated. Then silence again. Nothing else happened, but he knew the seal had been reinforced, that the door, though invisible, had closed a little more. In that instant, he understood the price of every closure: a memory, a wound. This time, as he returned to the truck, his memory dragged him back to his childhood, to his sick mother praying every night that they wouldn't find her. He'd never understood what she meant. Now he did. The second destination took him to the old water station in Monclova. It was completely abandoned, surrounded by dead trees and rusty structures. Martín walked among the remains, guided only by intuition. It didn't take long for him to find a trap door half covered by stones. He lifted it and descended a narrow staircase carved into the rock. The air was thick, almost unbreathable. At the far end, an altar carved into the wall had a perfect cavity for another key. Martín inserted it, and as he did so, something tightened in his chest. His vision blurred, and suddenly he saw himself in a reflecting pool in front of the altar. But it wasn't him. It was a child, his eyes filled with tears, repeating the words of a prayer he didn't remember learning. And then a voice, his mother. "Be quiet, Martín. If you speak, the doors listen." Martín knelt in front of the hole. There was no lock, no keyhole, and no keyhole for the last key. Just dirt. But something inside him knew what he had to do. He took out the key, held it for a few seconds, and then slowly buried it. As he covered it with his hands, the ground seemed to breathe. A warm breeze swept across the hill, and a murmur emerged from the stones like a distant lament. In that instant, an image crossed his mind like a flash of lightning. The young woman from the accident, the woman he had unwittingly killed, was looking at him with serene eyes. There was no reproach on her face, just one word: "Thank you." Martín fell back, his heart pounding. The third door had sealed, but something inside him had too. That night he slept little. Sister Teresa's diary, which he had kept under the seat for days, was gone. In its place, he found a loose sheet of paper written in the same handwriting. The guardian does not choose, he is chosen. Every wound, every loss, every silence was preparation. Martín read those words over and over again, his eyes burning. He understood now that nothing he had experienced had been random, that his loneliness, his silent faith, even his pain were part of the price. He unwittingly became the last link between the sealed and the free, the last link in a chain that must hold fast, or the world would hear again what must not be said. Did this part shock you? Then don't hesitate. Subscribe now. This channel needs your help to continue sharing what few dare to share. In the following days, Martín stopped making deliveries. He disappeared from the usual routes and dedicated himself to exploring secondary roads, forgotten stations, towns where no one remembered his name. He didn't look for clues anymore, but for signs. He frequently dreamed of Sister Teresa, who no longer spoke, only stared at him from a stone threshold. Sometimes, in the middle of the road, the radios in his truck would turn on by themselves, tuning into dead frequencies that repeated Latin phrases. Every day, the coincidences became clearer. He had sealed the doors, yes, but that didn't mean the danger was over, only that now he contained it. One afternoon, at a gas station in Matehuala, a little girl approached his truck with a bracelet in her hand. "This is yours," she said. Martín looked at her, confused. He didn't know her. The bracelet was made of black beads with a small cross, identical to the one his mother had worn decades before. The girl smiled and disappeared among the cars. He tried to follow her, but couldn't find her. When he returned to the truck, the cross shone dimly in the sunlight. He held it tightly, as if it were a promise. From then on, every time he passed certain points on Highway 57, he felt he wasn't alone, that something or someone was with him, not with threat, but with vigilance. On one of those silent journeys, Martín decided to return to the Santa Clara del Espiritu convent, where it all began in 1990. The building was still standing, although much of it was in ruins. The gatehouse was closed, but one of the side windows had broken glass. He went in. The air smelled of old wax and dampness. He walked through the dusty hallways, recognizing the broken, stained glass windows that had once depicted sacred scenes. In the old prayer room, he found a mural covered by sheets. When he removed them, he froze. The figures portrayed were the same 4 women he had seen on the side of the road, and among them, in a corner, a male figure with a rosary in his hand. His face. He felt dizzy. He took a few steps back, but tripped over a stone and fell. When he got up, he noticed the stone was actually a slightly raised slab of the floor. He moved it with effort and found a rusty metal box. Inside was another page from the journal. If you're reading this, it's because the cycle repeats itself. Each seal lasts only as long as the guardian endures. When it falls, they will open again. Martín gritted his teeth. There was no doubt. He wasn't just a witness. He was part of the design. His face on the mural, his name in the journal, his footsteps, coinciding with the places. Everything had led him here. He couldn't escape, but he shouldn't give up either. He left the convent with the box on the passenger seat and a determination he'd never felt before. It was no longer about searching for answers, but about maintaining the invisible line between what sleeps and what lurks. That same night, while sleeping parked in a solitary spot, he had the clearest dream of all. He was walking through a dry field, and in the distance, on a hill, stood an enormous cross made of roots and bones. Around him, figures dressed in white recited prayers without voices. One of them, blindfolded, approached and placed her hand on his chest. "As long as you breathe, they won't cross," she told him, and he woke up crying, not understanding why. The following weeks became a pattern. He traveled the same routes, making deliveries, greeting people politely. But each stop had another purpose. He left small symbols carved in wood, replicas of the Black Cross, in strategic locations, empty stations, lonely rest stops, forgotten ruins. It was as if something inside him knew where to reinforce, and each time he did, the ringing in his left ear, the one that had started the night of the first vision, calmed. He had found his purpose, not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as a vigilante, a silent one, without medals, without witnesses, just his truck, the journal, and the markings on the asphalt that guided him. On one of those nighttime trips, a storm caught him between Cedral and Estación 14. The rain pounded the windshield furiously, and visibility was almost zero. He decided to stop at an old iron bridge where he used to sleep during his early years on the road. As he got off, he noticed something that made him freeze. On the asphalt, right in the center of the bridge, were 4 figures covered in white cloaks, their backs to each other. They didn't move, they didn't speak, they didn't seem real. Martín approached slowly, his heart racing. When he was a few meters away, they all turned at the same time, but their faces were covered by bandages. One of them raised a hand, pointing south. Then they disappeared with the next flash of lightning. Martín didn't need any further directions. At dawn, he took the route they had indicated. It led him to an old, disused railway tunnel, buried in weeds and oblivion. It was a place not shown on any modern map. As he got out of the truck, he felt his steps become heavier, as if the earth resisted his advance. He entered the tunnel with a flashlight and advanced among the rubble. In the center, he found a stone table marked by fire and ash. On it, an engraved message: "The Guardian sees before all and bleeds in silence." Martín placed his hands on the stone. He felt a burning sensation in his palms. When he raised them, both had a cross burned into the skin. He emerged from the tunnel with his hands wrapped in makeshift bandages and his soul in tatters. No physical pain could compare with the spiritual weight he carried. In the rearview mirror for the first time, he thought he saw something moving inside the truck, in the empty space behind the seat. It wasn't a clear figure, not a threatening shadow. It was more of a presence, as if someone or something were traveling with him. He didn't feel fear, he felt company. When he turned on the radio, a soft, firm female voice said a single sentence: "One more to go." Then, only static. He hadn't tuned into any frequency. Martín understood that not all doors were physical, that there was still one more, not marked on maps or in journals, but within him. His last stop wasn't an external place, but a forgotten memory. The hospital where his mother spent her final days. He returned there after more than 20 years. The building was still standing, but now it was a nursing home. He spoke to a nurse, asked about old records. An elderly woman recognized him. "You're Marta's son, aren't you?" She prayed every night, saying one of her people had a mission, that the quietest one would be the bridge. Martín closed his eyes. His mother had known everything, long before he did. In a small room in the old hospital, he was allowed to see the few objects his mother had left behind. Among them, a worn notebook with handwritten prayers, but one page stopped him in his tracks. A child's drawing of a figure in a white robe with a truck in the background. Beneath it, a phrase: "Martín carries the light inside, even if he can't see it." Tears fell, unstoppable. It was as if everything was predestined, as if his mother had sown every step before she left. At that moment, he understood that the last door wasn't sealed with a key or a ritual. It was sealed with acceptance, with surrender. He left the hospital without looking back. He drove to a viewpoint he'd known since he was young, high in the Arteaga Mountains. There, at the edge of the abyss, he parked the truck and got out with the burned cross still visible in his hands. He lit a candle and sat on the hood. The wind was cold, but he didn't care. He prayed. He asked for nothing. He just gave thanks for having been chosen, for having survived, for having understood. When he opened his eyes, the sun was beginning to rise and the mountains seemed to be silently watching over him. Inside him, he felt for the first time in a long time, peace. And he understood that, although evil never sleeps, neither do those who have been marked to watch. Martín returned to the road with a new routine. He no longer followed trade routes or looked for deliveries. He only responded to calls that weren't audible. He knew where to stop, when to stop, and what to leave behind. Sometimes it was a carved cross, other times a stone with ancient symbols, and sometimes his presence alone was enough. He began to notice that others looked at him differently. Some drivers greeted him with respect, others avoided speaking. One day, a young truck driver approached him at a stop. "They say you've been where no one else has returned. Is that true?" Martín just smiled and offered him coffee. He knew that words sometimes opened more doors than they closed. Over time, some began to call him the Guardian. At first, it made him uncomfortable, but then he understood that names didn't matter. What counted was the silent, constant work. He became a point of reference among his people, a man you could go to if you saw things you couldn't explain. He didn't give answers. He just listened, nodded, and if necessary, put a hand on your shoulder and said, "You'll be fine, but don't stop at the curve at kilometer 231. Never. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. But every story that reached his ears became another fragment of the map he had been unwittingly building. One day, stopping at an old station between Saltillo and San Roberto, he found a letter taped to the bathroom door. It was written in firm handwriting, unsigned, and read, "The cracks don't disappear, they only shift. The new chosen one already has a name, he just needs to see." He felt a chill. He stuffed the letter into his jacket without a word. That night, he sorted through all the objects he had collected along his journey. Crosses, stones, loose pages, symbols, photographs, scraps of maps. Everything seemed part of a puzzle. But as he rearranged them on the truck's table, one thing became clear. At the center of the design was a name, not his own. Someone else. A young man he had helped months before, who had the same sparkle in his eyes he had lost. Martín understood that his time was coming to an end, not as punishment, but as a completed cycle. The road no longer needed him as it once did. But before retiring, he had one last thing to do. He returned to the railway tunnel where the burning seal lay and left all the objects he had collected over the years. He placed each one in the center of the stone table, next to the reliquary and the cross. He lit 4 candles, one for each missing nun. And in the midst of the silence, he spoke for the first time in a long time. "May the newly chosen one see clearly. May the seal not yield. May what sleeps continue to dream." The candle flames did not move, even though the wind blew strongly. From that day on, Martín stopped having strange dreams. The voices on the radio disappeared. The ringing in his ear faded, turning into pure silence. But it wasn't a void. It was a dense, firm peace, as if, finally, things were in their right place. He sold his truck to a young man from Zacatecas who was just starting out on the road. He handed him the vehicle clean, free of relics, but he left hidden in the glove compartment an envelope with a black cross and a handwritten phrase, "Listen to the silence, it will know when to speak." No one asked him why he did it. He didn't explain either. He just said goodbye with a handshake and a long look at the horizon. He settled in a small house on the outskirts of Arteaga. He grew herbs, read old books, and hiked the hills. No one suspected that this quiet man, who sometimes stared fixedly toward the north as if listening to something, had been part of an invisible battle. On Sundays, he went to Mass, sat in the back and smiled discreetly when he heard the children laughing. Once, a little girl approached him and asked if he was a saint. He let out a hearty laugh, shook his head, and offered her a honey candy. "No, little one, I'm just a man who learned to stay still when everything was shouting, and in that stillness he found meaning." But even in his retirement, Martín knew that his vigilance never ended. Every so often he felt a pang in his chest, a kind of silent call. It wasn't pain, It was direction. So he would pack a small backpack, take any bus, and travel wherever his instinct led him. He never stayed long, just long enough to ensure the silence remained sealed. On one occasion, he arrived at a small village in Durango, where an old chapel was burning without explanation. No one knew how the fire had started, but Martín found, among the rubble, an intact black cross. He took it, wrapped it in cloth, and threw it into the nearest river. The fire never returned. In another, he went to a fair in Matehuala, where a girl had fainted after touching an old book someone was selling as an antique. Martín examined it and knew instantly it shouldn't be there. He bought it without haggling, wrapped it in rope, and buried it. Under salt and ashes, in an open field just before nightfall. No one knew what he did. No one congratulated him. And that was fine. His work was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be done. Because he understood, like few others, that there are things that shouldn't be revealed, and that the true guardian doesn't fight evil with weapons, but with presence, perseverance, and faith. One night, when he returned home, he found a letter slipped under his door. It had no return address. It only said, "The echo has begun. The new one still doesn't hear." Martín held it for a moment silently before burning it with a candle without opening it. He didn't need to know more. He knew what it meant. Something had moved. But he also knew it was no longer his turn. He had done his part. He had closed the doors. He had contained the unspeakable. And above all, he had survived. Now it was his turn to trust. Even if it hurt. Even if he didn't know if the new chosen one would be ready. Because sometimes faith isn't believing. It's moving forward even without signs. Months passed without news. The days were calm, the nights silent. Martín aged peacefully, his hands marked and his soul at rest. One afternoon, while watering his plants, he saw a red truck pass by on the road near his house. Nothing unusual except for one detail. On the back, painted in white chalk, a symbol that only he would recognize. The black cross with thorns. He smiled. The new guardian had awakened, and with him, the cycle continued. No words were needed, no meeting was necessary, just knowing that someone else had heard the call. And that, as long as the seal passed from hand to hand, the world would continue to breathe easy. Over time, some of Martín's old acquaintances began to visit him, not out of curiosity, but for something deeper. They came with stories they didn't know how to explain, radios that turned on by themselves, crosses that appeared marked on doors, voices whispered in dreams. Martín welcomed them with hot coffee and attentive ears. He never interrupted. Only after listening to them until the end did he say a phrase that had become his signature. If the silence speaks to you, listen. And if it doesn't, keep walking. Because he understood that not everyone was ready, and that not everyone should be. Some were simply witnesses. Once, a young man asked him if he didn't feel alone with so much weight. Martín looked toward the mountains before answering. "I was alone, when I didn't know why things happened to me. Now I am accompanied by what I understand, and that's enough." The young man said nothing more. He simply hugged him before leaving, and Martín watched as his silhouette disappeared into the trees with that strange mix of nostalgia and certainty that only those who have experienced the inexplicable can recognize. He knew that the invisible network of guardians was woven without structure, without hierarchies, each with their own story, their own mark, their own moment, and all connected by something that didn't ask permission to reveal itself. If you've ever felt like Martín, you're not alone. Support this channel, subscribe and leave a comment. Every gesture you make keeps this mission alive. Martín began to write. Not a diary, not a will, just loose pages where he recounted his experiences without embellishment, without mystical explanations. He did it in case someone one day found his things and needed to understand. He kept the papers in a wooden box, along with old photos, newspaper clippings, and the cross he had removed from the tunnel. Writing helped him organize his memory, give form to the chaos. And in each line, he left space for whoever came next. Because if he had learned anything, It was that cycles don't end, they only transform, and that stories, when shared, can serve as a beacon. One morning, while he was drinking coffee on the porch, he heard an engine approaching. It wasn't common for someone to arrive at his house unannounced. The vehicle stopped at the entrance. A young man in his 30s got out, with a scraggly beard and wide-open eyes. He didn't say his name. He just took a small black cross out of his pocket. Martín nodded with unfeigned calm. He invited him in without question. That day they hardly spoke at all. They shared bread, silence, and a few shy smiles. As night fell, the young man stood up, shook Martín's hand firmly, and returned to his vehicle. As he drove away, Martín knew he had nothing more to do. The following days passed in unusual serenity. Martín no longer felt the urge to search or to intervene. It was as if, by entrusting this mission to the young man, he had sealed not only a cycle, but also a part of himself. Each morning was a simple blessing: the birdsong, the aroma of coffee, the distant sound of trucks passing by on the highway. He needed nothing more. His dreams were peaceful, without symbols, without tunnels, without fire. He slept soundly, as if his soul had finally found rest. One afternoon, while organizing some things on his desk, he found among his papers a drawing he didn't remember making. It was simple, done in pencil, but clear. A man standing in front of a door, with a light behind him. And beneath the image, a phrase written in his own handwriting: "To watch is to love without being seen." He stared at it for a long time, not remembering when he had written it. But he understood it was true, that his life had been just that. Not a heroic act, not a punishment, just a form of deep, silent love, offered without expecting anything. He closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and went out for a walk. As he walked along the path leading to the overlook, the same one where he had sealed the last door years before, he noticed that the landscape had changed. Not obviously, but something was different. The air seemed cleaner, the trees firmer. Even the silence had a different texture, denser, more alive. When he reached the top, he sat on the same rock as always and looked down into the valley. From there, he could see part of Highway 57, that winding line that had defined his life. He stayed there for hours, doing nothing, just watching, just being, because he understood he didn't need to do anything anymore. He'd done enough. That night, for the first time in years, he didn't lock his front door. He left the window ajar, the lamp on, and his notebook on the table. If someone came, he'd know what to do. If no one came, that was fine too. He slept without fear, without startles. The next day, a boy from the village saw him sitting on the porch, a blanket over his legs and a cup in his hand. He waved to him, and Martín responded with a calm smile. It was the kind of smile you give when you've made peace with everything, with the past, with your mistakes, with what could have been and wasn't. And that peace was his greatest legacy. As the days passed, Martín's figure became part of the landscape. Some neighbors said they always saw him in the same place, others that he talked to himself, and still others that he prayed in languages no one knew, but no one bothered him. He had earned a silent respect. Children greeted him with curiosity, and adults watched over him from a distance as one watches over a wise man or a madman. He didn't correct any version. He let them imagine him as they wished, because the important thing wasn't how they saw him, but what he had sown. And although no one knew it, many of those seeds were already sprouting. One autumn morning, he didn't get up at his usual time. The neighbor who brought him bread every other day noticed that the coffee cup was still untouched on the table. She entered cautiously and found him asleep in his chair, the notebook in his lap and the black cross dangling between his fingers. There was no pain, no struggle, no anguish, just a body that had finally released its burden. They called the doctor, who simply confirmed what was already obvious. Martín Aguilar, the man who once only wanted to avoid a stretch of road under construction, had reached the end of his journey, but what he had stopped would remain asleep, at least for a while longer. During his burial, which was simple but full of respect, some men from the road arrived silently. They were not family, not close friends. They were others like him, men of the road with tired eyes and scarred hands. One of them left a small black stone on the coffin, engraved with a symbol. No one asked what it meant. No one needed to know. An older woman dressed in white watched from a distance and then disappeared into the trees without a word. Martín had not died alone. He had departed accompanied by those who understood, even if they had never spoken. Days later, the young man in the red truck drove by again on the road near the village. This time he stopped his vehicle in front of Martín's empty house. He got out, opened the door without difficulty, and sat down at the desk. He found the wooden box, the notebook, the photographs, the crosses. He reviewed everything with a calmness that only the initiated possess. Then he took a new blank sheet of paper from his pocket and wrote in firm handwriting, "I am a witness, and as long as I breathe, the doors will remain closed." He put everything back together, carefully closed it, and left. The cycle continued. The silence, too. If you're still here, it's because something is calling you from deep within. Help make sure this story isn't lost. Subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. As time passed, Martín Aguilar's story became a legend among truckers. Some said he could still be seen on certain curves, especially at night, with a flashlight in his hand and a cross hanging from his neck. Others claimed that in moments of danger, his voice could be heard on the radio, giving precise directions. None of them looked for proof. There was no need, because they knew that in this world of long routes and endless nights, there are things that cannot be explained. They can only be felt. And they all agreed on one thing. Since his departure, the air on the highway had become a little calmer, but not everything remained whispers. In a village lost in the mountains, a group of children found a black cross among the roots of a fallen tree. They took it to the village teacher, who hung it in the classroom without knowing its origin. Days later, one of those children, a quiet boy with a deep gaze, began writing symbols in his notebook. No one had taught them to him. He only said he dreamed them. And among those symbols, someone recognized one. The same one that had marked the first door, decades before. The echo, as that anonymous letter had warned, had already begun. That child, unknowingly, was walking the same invisible line that Martín had once followed. But unlike the old guard, he wasn't alone. He lived in a time when the signs were more subtle, where the cracks were digital and the rituals were hidden in words and images. And yet the call was the same. The doors still existed, the danger too. But now, with each generation, one was born more willing to listen, to see, to act. Martín had sown something stronger than fear. He had left a legacy of vigilance, of responsibility, of conscious silence. On clear nights, when the moon bathes Highway 57 in its cold white light, some say the asphalt seems to glow for a moment, as if someone from another plane was still traveling along it. The most attentive say it's just the reflection of the headlights. But some old-timers along the road know better, that there are presences that don't fade with time or with death. And as long as someone remembers the story of Martín Aguilar, the man who didn't seek answers but found them, the balance between worlds will not be broken, because the road never ends for those who were chosen. And so, in a world that continues to turn without, noticing the invisible, Martín's story lives on the edges of the asphalt. Between forgotten stations and tunnels no one crosses anymore. His legacy is not in books or altars, but in knowing glances, in shared silences, in small hand-carved crosses. Because sometimes what prevents chaos from awakening isn't an army or a miracle. It's a single man who stops when everyone else continues, a man who listens to what others don't hear, a guardian who, unintentionally, chose to protect us. And as long as there's someone like him on the path, the doors will remain closed. You've reached the end. That means you're different. Help us continue sharing these stories. Subscribe to the channel now and keep Martin's legacy alive.